Hey y'all, let's talk about how to make your new photos look vintage. I'm going to be using one of the photos we shot for our client Louisville Parks Foundation, and I'm going to start by changing my workspace over to photography. And that's going to pull up this adjustments panel over here. We're going to start out by altering the color balance. Basically what you're going to want to do is pump up the yellows and reds in your midtones and your highlights, and add lots of blue into your shadow areas. We're really not going to touch the magenta green slider at all. I think that the cyan red and yellow blue sliders are all you're going to need to make a really nice, authentically vintage color adjustment. So you can just kind of start playing around, going with what feels right. I tend to find that for my midtones, 20 red and 30 yellow feels pretty right. And then I'll hop over to my highlights. And since this photo is so light and bright, changing these highlights even slightly is going to have a huge impact on the way that your photo looks. So I'm going to be a little more subtle here. I'm going to add maybe 10 red and 10 yellow. And then what's really going to pull all this together is your shadows. I'm going to pump up those blues by like 30. And it may not seem like we've made a huge difference here, but if we toggle that new adjustment layer on and off, you can see that it's a pretty solid difference. And for this client in particular, that's about where we left it. And they were going for more of a vintage inspired look rather than a, authentic vintage kind of photograph. So feel free to leave it where it is. This definitely has a nice lomography vibe to it. But if you want to push it a little further, you can come back over to this adjustment panel and start playing with curves. I usually like to add in a point, somewhere in here where the line falls already. You can put it right in the middle. I'm probably going to drop mine down closer to my shadows, since that is what I'll be altering the most. And you can start by just pulling your shadows way up. And you can see this is starting to change your black point. It's fading out those shadows. You're losing all of this detail in these areas. Your blacks are turning green, right? All those things that sort of happen with film photography, since it can't always absorb as much detail as digital photography. And then you can also change your highlights. I like to be a little more subtle there as well. If you pull it way over, you really, crash your saturation and get all of these tones that make your photo look very digital, not very analog. So I like to just, pull it over just a touch, just enough to sort of start getting some of those cyan hues in those blue areas, and you want to lose some of the detail in your really bright white highlights. So this is all just a matter of, going with what feels right. Maybe I'll bring up those blacks a little bit too. That's starting to feel pretty good. And then the last thing that you can do to really, drive home this vintage look is add some texture, right? Some noise. So for that, we'll be altering the photo itself. I usually like to just make a quick copy of it so that I have it unaltered in case I ever want to go back. And I'll drag that on up to the top and just turn it off for now. And then I'll click back down to the background, go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. And you can kind of play around with some of these settings. I usually leave it monochromatic, and I like uniform as well. I find that this one looks a little bit more like TV static than film photo static. And you can play with the amount as well. I find that even just, a slight amount really does something, something like 5 or 7%. But I usually like to pump it up to about 20, especially when you're going to be viewing these photos a little smaller, maybe on social media or something like that. And there you have it. If you, want to check it against your original, you can see here we've made some pretty intense adjustments. But yeah, there you have it. I hope that this answered some of your questions, and if you have any more, you can drop them in the comments below.